Ready to unwrap a surprise from Consumer Cellular? Experience the gift of freedom with no contract, no hidden fees, and always free activation. Here comes the holiday surprise. From now till December 31st, new customers can enjoy their second month for free. To get this holiday offer, visit consumercellular.com or call 1-888-FREEDOM and use promo code PODCAST. Act before December 31st to get your second month on us. Use promo code PODCAST.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Ken Adams, who began his professional career in 1981, treating children, adolescents, and their families. In 1985, he began private practice with Children of Alcoholic Parents program. It was there that he began to notice that many of these clients had addictions and enmeshment issues, two of his primary specialties today. He wrote his first professional article in 1987 on covert incest and sex addiction in alcoholic families, and has since written 3 books and numerous peer-reviewed articles. Dr. Adams maintains his clinical practice in Michigan, and he's also created and facilitates the Enmeshment Workshops, from guilt and ambivalence to passion and purpose, to help those struggling to break free from enmeshment. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ken.
You're welcome, Yasmin. Nice to be here. Anxious to and excited to share with you what I've learned.
Yeah, likewise. And so, Ken, can you kick it off and tell us what actually is enmeshment? And because I think it's a term not everyone universally has heard of or understands.
Sure. Although interesting, you may have noticed it's getting used more frequently in the culture at large. People are using it to describe what I think they use it for, which gets to the heart of our matter, is too much involvement, too much closeness at a cost to somebody's own independence or journey. And it emerges, the enmeshment in my field, psychology, comes from the family system therapist, who observe families functioning in different ways, and then looking at symptoms that children had and people had coming out of, shall we say, dysfunctional systems. And you had 2 extremes in family systems. You had people who were emotionally disengaged, little involvement with each other, little warmth, little loyalty, nobody particularly feeling valued in those systems. And we have too much of that in our culture here in the States. And what's interesting is that on the other end is what we call enmesh systems, which there is too much involvement from family members, high degrees of dependency, high degrees of loyalty, at a cost to autonomy and independence on the part of young adults. And one of the ways that shows up invariably that I've learned over years now is that these adults who come from enmeshed systems in which there's binds of loyalty to the family, we call it the family brain. It's one of the podcasts I want to do one day, is the family brain and why you need your own, is that the loyalty is to the family brain at a cost to your own. And I'm chuckling, but it's really not a funny matter, because if you're caught in one of these enmeshed family systems, the loyalty is first, second, and third to the family. That is the parents, those who are in charge, and your needs come second. And then, sadly, your partner or spouse's need even goes further down the list. So I get, on a routine basis, calls and emails from spouses and partners of enmeshed men, for example, who complain about these men's mothers who are primary front and center in their lives, and how they get little of the emotional love energy from these men, if we pick on men for the moment, although women also can be very enmeshed with their systems, but have some differences. So that's enmeshment: too much loyalty, too much dependency, what looks like closeness, and indeed there is closeness and there is warmth, which is legitimate, but behind that are these implicit, sometimes explicit demands based on guilt and loyalty to be loyal to the system at a cost to your own independence. So that's probably the thrust of the definition that we're looking at here.
So, Ken, why does this happen? And I'd love to also go a little bit further into how it shows up within the family dynamic. So, you said men was kind of the first gender that you picked on, men and their mothers. How does it also play out with women? And is it more prevalent with one dynamic over the other?
Those are good questions. Let me see if I can get. So, how does it happen? Well, again, so remember, families function in different ways and at in different times. So during crisis, families come together. Dependency, loyalty increases. People circle the wagons. First generation, my mother's family was Hungarian. They came over. My grandparents came over from Hungary, and so you see this in immigrant families and other systems where there is temporary need for the system to sort of circle the wagons. But if it gets stuck there, it's problematic. So the functioning can be normative in a lot of different situations and cultures and so forth, and the closeness is welcomed in a lot of places. Where it gets a little bit off the rails is when it's used in the service of filling. We'll talk about the parents. When the parent's own personal needs are not met in their marriage, for example, or in their own family of origin, they will turn to one of the children or some of the children to fulfill their narcissistic or dependency needs at a cost to the needs of the child. That's really when it crosses the line. When the relationship between parent and child is in the service of the parent at a cost to the child. So we see that coming from marriages that are not working, or parents whose own childhoods have been disrupted by enmeshment or neglect or abuse. And so they come into these marital bonds sort of half-baked, if you will, and not really fulfilled, and then turn to one of their children to fulfill them. Now, being a parent myself, and I'm guessing many of your listeners will be too, I'll remind people that there's a normal love affair between parent and child, right? And so, kids want to marry their parents and have babies and, that kind of stuff. And that's they're not watching Disney or reading Freud. That's biologically driven. It's hardwired. Your first love affair is always with your parents, your primary caretaker. And ideally, that first love affair, that first relationship should be held in the service of the child, not in the service of the parent. And one of the other ways this enmeshed dynamic becomes dysfunctional is when it services the parent. Oh, that sweet boy of mine adores me. I will turn to him rather than my husband for comfort, for counsel. I'll tell him my secrets. And my loneliness I will fulfill with his presence. And unfortunately, that young boy, in this case, if we're looking at boys and their mothers, although it happens with daughters and their fathers and daughters with their mothers too, is the boy feels trapped by that. He feels, of course, he loves his mother, wants to please her, but he also needs to leave her, right? He needs to separate. And that first act of separation is in the early years, somewhere between 2 and 3. And so forth. And then later in adolescence and young adulthood, he needs to leave. He needs to find his path. And if he's wedded to his mother, I'm going to use that on purpose now. If he's wedded to his mother, he's in trouble. Because his loyalty and his feeling of guilt and obligation will be to her first. And so when it comes time to partner romantically, he's in trouble, and so is the person who has fallen in love with him. And so, because of course he's learned to charm, right? Because he's learned that from his mother. He knows how to please. He knows how to please his woman, here looking at heterosexual for the moment. And so the woman falls in love with him, and she thinks she's found, nirvana, because he's very attentive, until she wants more commitment. And then he feels trapped.
Ken, what happens when there is a desire for a further commitment? What gets triggered by that?
Well, so remember, let's come back to now. I love my mommy, but I'm trapped, right? So now all of her needs become assimilated, meaning I take them inside of me and I absorb them as if they're my responsibility. But they're not really supposed to be, right? I'm not supposed to absorb my mother's woes and loneliness and neediness as mine, right? That's her job. That's my father's job. That's her partner's job. And her job to figure that out. How did I get stuck with that? And invariably, these kids who get in trouble because of enmeshment tend to have very sensitive temperaments and tend to be very empathic in terms of their temperamental qualities. So they naturally feel bad, right? I don't want my mother to be lonely. So he kind of takes that into his, so he's been burdened, right? I've absorbed these feelings and needs. I'm off at school. I'm worried about my mother, so I have school phobia, right? I used to work, my first professional work was with children, and we had these school phobic kids, and they weren't afraid of school. They were in conflict about leaving their mothers because they were so worried and tethered, use that word on purpose, tethered to their mother's worries. And so that sort of weaves itself into the emotional attachment template. In other words, our capacity for attachment. How do we do? Are we secure being around close to people? Are we comfortable with our own needs and someone else's needs? That all originates in these early attachment experiences. Primarily, they can be affected by other relationships, of course, later. And so I take that feeling that I'm trapped, right? And I'm stuck. And so my partner says, oh, geez, won't it be a good idea if we think about marriage down the road? Now, he doesn't hear that as an invitation and as an exciting delight. He hears it as a trap. He feels it as an obligatory bound. And now my romance has become an obligation to me. Now she wants too much from me. Now she's going to be dependent on me. Now her neediness will be mine. And so he transfers those feelings onto the romantic partner, and he begins to become ambivalent. So ambivalence is a big issue with men and women who come from enmeshed systems. They can't really commit, or they're impetuous in their commitments and then they back out.
Wow.
And they feel trapped, they feel obligated. And so I can't stiff arm my mommy because she'll be hurt. And then my dad will call me and my brother will call me. And then pretty soon I got the whole family brain working on me. So I'm going to stiff arm my woman or my partner, or I'll betray her. I'll go off and have an affair, or I'll use porn or something else in which I'm free to be unobligated to you, or I'll pay a sex worker, right? So we see these sexual escapes sometimes as a result, because I can't betray my mother, I can't betray my family, but someone's going to get betrayed. Someone's going to get the wrath of my need to be disloyal.
And it's usually never the parent. It's always the partner who gets betrayed.
That's what I've seen. 600 men and women across the globe in my Overcoming Enmeshment workshops, and 9.5 out of 10 come in under the umbrella of that issue.
Wow.
Yeah, it's almost, it's so predictable. I can't tell you. And you know you're onto something when you see multiple stories that have the same symptom package, right? You know you have a disorder, or you know you have a symptom or syndrome issue when you keep getting the same stories. So I get these men and women sitting in our workshops. We do these online workshops, and it's as if they're telling each other stories over and over again. And the difficulty with commitment and the betraying the partner and feeling trapped with the partner, 9.5 out of 10 times is the primary complaint.
Wow. So I have so many questions. So what is like a healthy amount of kind of time and maybe even emotional exchange between a parent and a child? And is it like the emotional neediness of a parent like that creates this tension? Because I think with some families, there's a expectation to check in a lot more often than others. So I'm just curious, like based on what you've seen, what's sort of like a healthy amount of exchange? What are like the layers of emotional exchange? And maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that will no doubt dovetail us into maybe even cultural differences and so forth. But so clearly, if I gave you a formula, we'd find exceptions, wouldn't we? And so the real answer. So I know families who have lots of contact who aren't enmeshed, and I've worked with people who haven't had contact with their parents or mothers for a year, or their mothers have passed, and they still carry the enmeshed dynamic of guilty obligation, and they transfer it to other people, and they act that out with their spouse. And so frequency of contact by itself is not an indicator, although, if you're calling your mother 3 or 4 times a day, or she's calling you, and she's burdening you with her helplessness and her neediness, or your father is, or your brother is, and pretty soon you're carrying those issues, and then you get home and your partner wants to talk and spend time with you, and you can't be bothered. The frequency becomes an issue, right? And you need to start looking at separating. Having boundaries about contact. Like, I can't talk to you every day. Don't call me with all your worries. Of course, and that's a reasonable boundary with a parent, right? I love you dearly, but don't call me every day with your problems with dad. I'm not your counselor. There's no reason you can't say that, except in an enmeshed system, you don't dare say that.
Wow.
Because it's seen as disloyal, and it will be experienced as disloyal, and there'll be retribution and guilt. So, but here's my answer. The line in the sand, because that's what you're asking, right? Where's the line? The line in the sand cannot be determined until you're free of obligatory assignment. So, how do I know where my line of caring, how often should I check in with my mother or father versus, when should I let some space be there? I can't decide that if I'm under obligatory contract on a daily basis. So the first order of business is to, and I'll say this directly, but carefully, is to divorce the contractual arrangement that my obligation is to you. Once that happens, now I'm free to love you on my terms. I'm free to call you because I want to see how you're doing. I'm not calling you because I have to. I'm calling you because I want to. So then the frequency of contact is defined by my desire to share love and concern, not based on obligation, because I have let go of my role as the golden boy or golden girl to you. I'm no longer your little boy or little girl. I'm my own man. And my best advice to you, mother, is for you to treat me like a man and not your boy. And so that is really the answer to your question in my experience, is that you can't know the line until you're free of the obligation, until you're on the other side of the line and say, no, my loyalty is 1, to myself, 2, to my partner, and then my own family of procreation, whatever that looks like, and then to you, family of origin. Notice that's the 4th on the list.
Wow. So the family comes last.
The family comes down the list. Now, under conditions of, then how? So we get this a lot in our workshops. We get people showing up and their parents are aging and they need help and so forth. Well, how do I help them? And that requires more involvement. And so, but even there, I still need to operate from the placeholder that my life is my priority. I want to help you, but I'm not going to give my life up to help you, because isn't that your job, mother, father, is to send me off into the world, by the way, right? I've been describing this lately because I've learned this from the men and women who've come into the workshop. I think this as a parent myself, my son's in college and I'm watching, I have to sort of manage my own separation from him. He's his own person, and which is great, which is what you want, right? But there's always a loss, right, for parents, even under the best of conditions. So I say it this way. The last spiritual assignment of the parent is to take the loss.
What does that mean?
That means I grieve the loss of my emerging adult son or daughter. It is not his or her job to cushion the blow.
Wow.
It is my job, my last assignment as a parent before I transition to a more co-equal relationship with my adult son or daughter, is to live with the grief that my little boy or my little girl has moved on. And that's a good thing, but it's sad for me. And it's true. There's a normal sadness and grief in that, but it's the parent's assignment to do that grieving. It is not the child's assignment to cushion the blow.
Wow.
And so in enmeshed systems, that's all backwards. That's all backwards. So the family brain, the enmeshed system brain, so the loyalty is to the brain, the loyalty is to the system, the mother, the father who is defining it. And so I have to give up my independence and cushion you and comfort you, and I'm going to have to move back from college, or I can't really marry the person I want to marry, or they're in conflict with you. And I can't tell you the number of stories I get where there's fighting between the spouses, between the spouse and the parent, and the enmeshed man or woman is caught in the middle, and they're trying to placate everybody, but it's impossible because they still feel under the obligation to cushion the loss for the parent, but it's really not your job. Which doesn't mean you don't love them, or you don't say, look, I love you, Mom. I love you, Dad. I want to visit with you. But my loyalty is to my family. So if you go into the family system literature, which is where a lot of this enmeshed stuff comes from, a family system therapist, meaning therapists who work with the entire family system, for example. And you'll see these repeated list of healthy functioning family systems and couple systems. One of the characteristics that invariably is on every list is that the loyalty to the family of procreation, meaning your romance, your life, your children, is greater than the family of origin. Now think about that for a minute. The loyalty to the family of procreation is greater than the family of origin. And so that's where the line is. And so notice it doesn't say equal to. A lot of enmeshed men and women try to equal out and parse out the loyalty and love to everybody in hopes that everybody's happy. And of course, nobody's happy, including themselves. They try to placate everybody, and they really get resentful, and they begin to withdraw or act out with food or sex or so forth.
And does that play out both like emotionally, financially, physically?
How do you mean? Say more about that.
Yeah. So in terms of, the line that's kind of the obligation piece, like does that kind of manifest in different levels? Like, does it just, is it emotional? Is it financial? Like, does this enmeshed son or daughter, for example, feel responsible for like taking care of their parents' financial situation? Or
yes. Yeah. Yes, no, I hear now what you're asking. Yes, you can see different aspects or different layers of the obligatory assignment, all the way from taking on the parents' emotional problems to paying, helping them out financially. And so we get various stories about that, or vice versa, where the parent has has money that they're bequeathing or giving to the child, and they'll keep the money as a leverage. And so one of the things that young adults who have been enmeshed, is they have to be willing to let go of wanting the money from the parents in order to be free. So sometimes money is used both ways. So sometimes the boundaries, we often talk about setting boundaries, right? This concept of setting boundaries. And so how do I love you? Okay, I want to assist you financially, but I'm not going to be responsible for your bills on an ongoing basis. I have to take care of my own family. I can allot you X amount of dollars per year, but don't call me on a daily basis for money or a monthly basis. So somewhere there has to be a rearrangement of the contractual assignment. So you see, we're back to that line in the sand, right? Where if I don't divorce and when I say divorce, I mean internally, if I don't let go of my contractual assignment that I'm responsible to my parents, then I can't turn around then and freely give the love and support that I do want to give. And so, and that includes money, and that includes physical time. And that includes, emotion, how we talk, right? So I don't want you to call me up and tell me about, your problems with dad anymore. I feel bad. I feel caught in the middle. I think you and dad should work this out. Let's talk about the weather. So we have to teach. One of the things we do is we work with adults who are enmeshed in their systems and help teach them how to have a loving conversation, but not to get ensnarled in the drama.
What do you do though when a parent is unable to register that request?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that ideally we'd like our parents' blessing, right? We'd like to say, you brought me in this world to be my own man or own woman, and I'd like your blessing. Emancipation, because that's what we're talking about here, right? We're emancipating, is not it's not a negotiation. I don't need your approval. I would like your blessing. And so in some cases, the parents won't give it. And sometimes they'll be very explicit about that. And even, so we have some family systems that will retaliate and get quite harsh. And that's really a difficult situation. And it forces the adult child into an unfair position of having to choose. And so there aren't any easy answers there, but I take your audience back to my position that first order of business is to divorce the contractual arrangement so you can think clearly about how you want to respond to that. Look, you guys are threatening me, cutting me off. I would hate that you do that. I love you dearly, but I'm not going to give up my life just because you threaten me. I would ask that you treat me like an adult. So you have to come back as the adult, right? And sort of speak and give them the words that they need to think about. Mom, if you want me around, I would suggest another approach. Stop guilting me. And please start treating me respectfully as somebody who deserves their own life. I'll be wanting to come around then. So you're going to have to give the language to the parents and almost give them the assignment about how to treat you. In a lot of cases, the parents will find their place around that. There are some exceptions where parents become retaliatory, even disown, and you have a very dysfunctional enmeshed system when the parents disown their own children because they want their own lives. But we've seen it. And I don't have an easy answer for you there because it puts you in the position of two choices, doesn't it? You either have your own life or you sacrifice it for your parents. And that's unfair. That is really unfair. That's the best I can say there. It's almost cruel for a family system to do that to their children.
And I want to go back also to this earlier point about what you said, like ambivalence or an inability to commit to the partner over the parent. What does that look like? And maybe you can share some stories from your own workshops or practices, like what has worked well, what hasn't worked well, and maybe speak more about that kind of characteristic and why it plays out.
Yeah. So again, let's come back to the overall theme: is this enmeshed woman or man? And I just remind you, we've been talking mostly here about men and their mothers, and that's not really fair to women who can have these experiences. Just briefly, you had asked this earlier, with their fathers, although we'll often see women more to be their surrogate, the father's surrogate girlfriends, right? Or they'll be their mother's surrogate husband or best friend or loyal partner because the father is absent. And so the women will have very similar sets of characteristics about commitment issues that we see with men. around this, although women find it more difficult to break free of this enmeshment. I think because of cultural reinforced attitudes that women are responsible for caretaking their parents, and men get a pass on that to some degree. So women have this extra heavy lifting to do around having to get past cultural reinforcement messages around that. Having said that, both men and women will struggle with commitment because they've absorbed the burdens of helplessness, neediness, loneliness of the parent. And so they get into a relationship, and there's stories are almost eerily similar, where they'll be reacting strongly and angrily to simple requests for increases in commitment, or even or a difficult conversation, and pretty soon they're raging at. So we get lots of overreactive anger and rage issues on the part of enmeshed individuals towards their partner, because they feel as if they've encroached upon their space. And they begin to feel threatened that your needs, and of course, any romantic relationship requires, even under the best of circumstances, long-term romances require, two individuals who are in their adult presence and can negotiate and talk and be vulnerable and so forth. But if you add the ghost in the bedroom, mother or father, which is what happens, right? So we get reports of people, I get lots of reports of sexual dysfunction. I can't get aroused, and so, I've had many consultations where, the spouse will report that after a conversation with his mother, he doesn't want anything to do with me. He won't touch me. He won't talk to me. I approach him sexually, and he can't even get aroused. And what's happened is that he has to shut down his body just to defend against the mother's intrusion. And unfortunately, he takes that into the bedroom and in and out of the bedroom, frankly. So he's gone numb as a way to defend against it. So we see sexual dysfunction or ambivalence. So if we get into a fight, I'm ready to leave, right? Rather than an argument is an opportunity for the two of us to figure out what's going on and to grow together. So in the face of conflict, or the fact that you're needy, I'm ready to leave. So I have a sense of ambivalence. So we see a lot of ambivalence. I don't know if I'm going to come to the party. I'm not sure. I'll let you know last minute whether I'm going to be there or not. So we get this sort of ambivalence around commitment, all the way from romance to showing up at a dinner party. And difficulties with commitment as a result of that, because commitments feel burdensome. I feel locked in, and that means I have to take care of you. And to some degree, that's conscious, and in other ways, it's not conscious. It just is. It's in the fabric of my selfhood. And so when you show up as somebody who's having a bad day, so you come home and I'm the enmeshed man, and for example, and my spouse has had a bad day, the enmeshed man immediately feels like he has to fix and absorb the problems, and he's angry at his wife, for example, for having a bad day, and she's bewildered why he's having such a hard time listening to her, because in his inner world, it feels like an obligatory mess that I now have to take on. She just wants someone to listen to her, right? She's confused. He's brought someone into the conversation that doesn't belong. It's his mother. So we have ghosts in the bedroom. We have ghosts in the house. We have the parents, the template of the parents' energy where it doesn't belong. So lots of commitment issues. That's why, for example, we have men into the workshop whose mothers have passed away, or maybe they've had these rigid boundaries where they haven't talked to them for the year. They still have the same problems in relationships. They may have an immediate relief if their mother had passed away, but it doesn't last, because the internal landscape of my attachment template, if you will, contains the obligatory assignment that my mother left with me, even if she's passed away.
And so, Ken, the sort of emancipation piece, the solution is to declare your independence on all levels from a parent. And, and is it appropriate? Because I think this is such a confusing space, right? Because I think a lot of people, we feel, especially if we're, close with our parents or we feel connected to them in relationship, like how is it appropriate to talk about your romantic relationship with your parent? Like what's sort of the line there?
Well, it depends on how it's used, right? I mean, if the parent's over involved in usurping or undercutting your marital bond, then you probably don't want to talk to them about your romance, right? Because it becomes a violation of the sacred space between you and your partner, right? So there needs to be a place of safety. So in a coupleship, well, actually, we're doing a talk tomorrow in our Overcoming Enmeshment. We do a monthly webinar on a free webinar for enmeshed systems. People, by the way, can find out about our stuff on overcomingenmeshment.com. But I'm actually the speaker tomorrow, and we're going to talk about Valentine's Day. And one of the core issues in a coupleship is creating a container, a safe bubble or a safe space in which both partners protect that bubble from intrusion. And so it depends. If I bring my story about my romance to my family, do they support me or do they try to undermine it? If they undermine it, then I should not bring it to them, because my responsibility is to protect that romantic space and to prevent intrusion from the outside that would disrupt it. So it really depends on how that's translated.
So, Ken, I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the pandemic, and because I think a lot of people have not just become, enmeshed with their families, but probably in their romantic partnerships. So I'd love to talk about what you've noticed over the last several years, like how the pandemic has sort of played out in relationships. Obviously, there's been a massive increase in divorce. I think it's been an especially hard time to be in a partnership. So I'd love for you to talk about that, if you've noticed any trends or themes or any kind of surprises.
Yeah, that's a great question. Very insightful. I hadn't thought about that. I have thought about that, but I hadn't thought about it for our conversation today. But you're right. The pandemic has increased proximity to those we love and it kind of stuck, right? So, I like hanging out with my wife, but okay, this is a little too much here, and we're kind of stuck in the four walls of the house. And it has activated and I should say aggravated these enmeshment dynamics. So what I've seen is I want to say a 5 to 6-fold increase in the numbers in my workshops, in the contacts. I'm getting a dozen contacts a day from people. That was not happening before the pandemic. Now, that may be a function of the fact, too, that the work, that I've been doing has gotten broader recognition and so forth. But I have noticed an increase in the pandemic, that it has aggravated these dynamics, because it's harder to have a sense of separateness and still welcome you in my space if you're always in my space, right?
Right.
And if we're always reacting to each other. So there needs to be, in a secure attachment, there's a shuttle between who I am as a person, right, and my independence, and then sharing who I am with you in another space, emotionally, romantically, sexually, in which we come together and we sort of collapse into each other's arms, literally and figuratively. But then I move back out of that space, and I need to be able to come and go in that space in order for me to be able to be present, to be functional sexually, to be true to myself, and to be able to share with you what I need to. But I can't be constantly having you in my space or vice versa and expect myself to have a self, right? So during the pandemic, we have seen this sort of collapsing of these boundaries and an aggravation of these enmeshed dynamics, for sure.
Yeah. And I'm also curious if you have tools for people who are maybe like getting into new relationships during the pandemic in terms of creating that physical space. And also, one thing we didn't talk about is the difference between enmeshment and codependency, because I think those terms get, uh, what's the word? They sort of get overlapped or replaced with each other. So yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, so those are related but distinctly different terms. So codependency can be an overused term, but it does describe people who tend to be excessively concerned about how you feel about me, right? And so I'm apt to drop who I am and what I'm doing to please you and to organize around you, right? But there's more than one way I become codependent. I can come from a physically abusive family, a sexually abusive family, a neglectful family. What it lacks is these obligatory loyalty contracts in which I'm bound to you out of guilt. So they share this dependency, this increased dependency, but people from enmeshed systems have a greater degree of guilty, obligatory contractual assignments that I must be loyal to you at a cost to myself. So it's a little more specific. We see a lot more ambivalence in the enmeshed system versus codependents tend to sign up for relationships rather quickly and declare their loyalty rather quickly. And we see some of that with enmeshed folks, but not as often. We tend to see more ambivalence.
How do you work through codependency in relationship?
Well, so we can borrow a little bit from the enmeshment recovery as well. And so I think you have to come in similarly to the enmeshment work and have a sense of value about who I am. I am of value on my own, right? I am worth being treated well. I'm worth having a life, pursuing my own interest. And I don't need someone else to define what that should be. So that's a shared piece to both recoveries from codependency and enmeshment recovery. So the first, so you're kind of asking about how to recover from this. You have to confront the belief system. So if I carry a core belief that other people's needs are more important than mine, or that I'm obligated to my family, I can set as many boundaries as I want, and I'll just collapse them if I haven't challenged my beliefs. So examining and rearranging, or at least shifting the core belief system so that you are of value and you understand that your needs may be important and I want to tend to them, but your worries are not my worries. So so when we talk about recovery from enmeshment, and I think we'll use this as a sort of crossover with codependency since you brought two terms up, but let me talk about enmeshment here, because I think they're transferable. So one is challenging the belief. Second step then is to have a set of boundaries. It sounds like you're hurting today. I'm happy to share a call with you, but I can't listen. I'm only available for 10 or 15 minutes. So we begin to have boundaries about how frequently we talk to people, topics of conversation, how often, who we hug, who we let touch us, and so forth. And then there's this concept that's a little more difficult to understand, that's different than separation. So again, I got these guys who come into the workshop who have been separated from their mothers for a year or their families, but they're not differentiated. Now, differentiated is a term used to say, your feelings are not my feelings. Your worries are not my worries. Your needs are not my needs. What codependents and enmeshed individuals share is a lack of differentiation with other people. And so beginning to practice sort of holding your space, kind of taking a deep breath, and, and somebody's going on and on about your mother or father is going on, or your brother or sister or your lover, is holding space for them, but not absorbing that as yours. That's an internal boundary. That's learning to differentiate me from you. And that's different than an external boundary that I'm not going to call you every day. Because we've got guys, again, who don't call their mothers every day, but they worry and feel guilty throughout the entire day because they're not differentiated. They haven't challenged their belief. And so finally, the last stage of enmeshment recovery, and to some degree codependency, is emancipation. I'm living my life on my terms, not yours. And I'll care about you, I'll love you, but I'll love you from the perspective that works for me as well. And so that's a more emancipated position than I love you based on what you need. Which isn't to say that, in relationships, romantic relationships, we don't sacrifice at times or give to others. Of course we do.
And so if the parent is disappointed, that's okay, right? Like as the
well, it's not going to feel okay. But it is expected. It is part of the transitional space. I mean, parents love their kids, even we take it out of enmeshment, right? And so there's a sort of disappointment, or let's call it loss or grief. There's a loss and grieving as our children move on. The great Lebanese poet Gibran, he wrote a number of things on different topics, but one of them was on children. And I'm going to get this not quite right, but he said, your sons or daughters are not yours. Their life's longing for itself.
Yeah, I love that.
And so I think I'll kind of close here in a moment with you, but I think that's a good reminder that children are life's longing for itself, and the parents, as he says in the poem, are the bows or the archers, rather, by which they thrust their children into the world. And the job of the archer, he says, is to stay sturdy. And so it is not the job of the children flying away to come back and solidify that parent. So I love his poem. It's worth reading if you get a chance.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ken. I know we're at time, but where can people find you, find more about the Enmeshment Workshops and some of your books?
Yeah, so I think probably the quickest way is just to go on the website, Overcoming Enmeshment, one word, overcomingenmeshment.com.
Great. And your books are on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken. This was so lovely. I learned so much. I'm sure that this is going to help so many people. So thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome. You did a great job, and thank you for having me, and take care. All right.
Take care. All the best. For our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about enmeshment and healthy boundaries with Dr. Ken Adams. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.